The mafia boss's mother collapsed, and only the black nanny knew what to do. The mansion was silent, save for the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the long hallway. The sprawling estate, with its marble floors and golden chandeliers, felt more like a palace than a home. But inside, something wasn't right. The mafia boss's mother, once a vibrant woman who had ruled over the household with a gentle but commanding presence, was now lying motionless on the floor. Panic spread through the room like wildfire as her family members gathered around, helpless and frantic. "Get a doctor, now," screamed the mafia boss, his voice sharp with fear. His hand trembled as he dialed the emergency number, but even as the call went through, it was clear that time was running out. The air in the room felt heavy, each second passing like an eternity. The staff, once invisible, now stood frozen in place, uncertain of what to do. No one was prepared for this. No one except one person. The black nanny, who had worked for the family for several years, quietly stepped forward from the corner where she had been watching. Her hands were steady, her expression calm, despite the chaos surrounding her. The mafia boss's mother had been a mother figure to her in many ways. She had treated her with kindness, and in return, the nanny had taken care of her with the same devotion she had shown to her own family back home. But now, in this moment of crisis, the nanny knew that this was her time to act. Without saying a word, she approached the elderly woman and knelt beside her. The room seemed to hold its breath as she checked the woman's pulse and gently placed her hand on her chest. The mafia boss's eyes, wide with concern, were fixed on her. He was unsure of what to do. His wealth and power had never prepared him for something like this. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. But the nanny didn't answer him right away. She knew the best thing she could do in this moment was to remain calm and focused. She wasn't a doctor, but she had witnessed enough in her life to know the signs of a stroke or heart attack. With a steady hand, she carefully adjusted the woman's position and began to perform the basic life-saving techniques she had learned over the years. The rest of the household watched in stunned silence. The mafia boss, too, stood frozen, watching as this woman, who had always been in the background, now took charge. As the seconds stretched on, the room felt both impossibly still and unbearably tense. The mafia boss, still unsure whether to intervene or allow this woman to continue, felt a strange sensation in his chest. Could she really save his mother? Was this the right decision? He had never seen anyone act with such quiet authority, especially not someone from the staff. But in that moment, it was clear that she was the only one who knew exactly what to do. The nanny's gentle touch seemed to calm the situation, and slowly, the tension in the room began to lift. The mafia boss could feel a shift in the air, something he hadn't expected, and it made him realize something he had never considered before. This woman, this black nanny, was not just a caretaker. She was someone who had earned her place in this house, someone who understood life and death in a way he had never needed to. He had always overlooked her, thinking her role was nothing more than menial labor, but now, as she knelt beside his mother, he realized just how wrong he had been. The room was still. The chaos from moments ago had dissipated, replaced by an eerie silence that weighed heavily in the air. The mafia boss stood there, eyes fixed on the black nanny as she continued to care for his mother. His mind raced with confusion, disbelief, and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the seconds stretched into minutes, he watched her gently move his mother, adjusting her position to keep the blood circulating. The nanny was calm, too calm for someone in the middle of a life-or-death situation, and that made him uncomfortable. He had never truly seen her as anything more than the help, the quiet woman who took care of his household. But now, seeing her take charge in a moment of crisis, a new thought entered his mind. Why was she the only one who seemed to know what to do? His own family had been paralyzed with fear, unable to act. His mother, the one woman who had always been the pillar of the family, was lying unconscious in front of him, and all he could do was watch. His mind flickered to all the times he had seen her running the household with grace and power, never showing weakness. Yet here she was, reduced to a fragile figure who could barely hold on. The nanny's actions were precise, each movement deliberate. She had been the first to step forward, and now she was the first to ensure his mother was stable. The mafia boss's thoughts were interrupted by a soft but firm voice. "She will be all right," the nanny said, not looking up. It was a simple statement, but in that moment, it was exactly what he needed to hear. The Mafia boss swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease that was creeping into his chest. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued adjusting his mother, making sure every breath counted. Then, after a long pause, she finally spoke. "I've seen this before. It's not the first time I've had to act in an emergency like this." The words hit him like a slap in the face. He had always underestimated her. But now, standing in the middle of a crisis, it was clear that she was the one who had the strength and wisdom to save his mother. "You've saved someone before?" The Mafia boss's voice softened, more out of disbelief than anything else. She nodded, her face still focused on his mother. "I've seen death and I've seen life," she said quietly. "I know when it's time to fight for someone's life, and when it's time to let go. But your mother, she's a fighter." Her words, though simple, were like a balm to his frayed nerves. For the first time since the incident began, he felt a flicker of hope. His mother wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to leave them. But even as that thought crossed his mind, the reality of the situation still hung in the air. The nanny wasn't just acting as a caretaker in this moment. She was saving his mother's life. And as much as it pained him to admit, he knew that she was the reason his mother was still alive. He could hear the subtle shift in the sounds around them. His family members, who had once been frantic and hopeless, now seemed quieter, almost reverent. The respect they had always given to the Mafia boss was now turning toward her. The nanny, the woman who had spent years in the background, had taken control when it mattered most. The Mafia boss stepped back, his emotions tangled in a web of awe and confusion. He had never thought of her as anything more than an employee. But now, watching her steady hands and calm demeanor, he couldn't help but wonder if he had misjudged her all these years. Could it be that she was more than just the hired help? Could she be the key to something greater? As the minutes passed, and the color slowly returned to his mother's face, the Mafia boss stood in the shadows, silently reflecting on everything he had just witnessed. The woman who had always been invisible to him was now the one holding everything together. And in that moment, he realized that he owed her more than he had ever imagined. He could no longer see her as just a maid or nanny. She had proven herself to be so much more. His heart, though still heavy with worry, began to stir with something else, a growing sense of gratitude. And for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss realized that maybe, just maybe, this woman had a place in his life far beyond what he had ever believed. The next few hours passed in a blur, but to the Mafia boss, it felt like an eternity. His mother had been stabilized, though still unconscious, resting on the expensive silk sheets in her room. Doctors arrived shortly after the nanny had managed to keep his mother alive, but by then, it was clear that her actions had made all the difference. They were polite, but their eyes held a silent recognition of what had just occurred. The Mafia boss stood at the foot of his mother's bed, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, unable to look away from the woman lying there. His mind raced, conflicted between relief that his mother was still alive and confusion about the woman who had saved her. The nanny. For the first time, he was truly seeing her, not as the quiet, obedient woman who had taken care of his home for years, but as someone who had just stepped in and saved his mother's life. A woman with strength, intelligence, and a calmness he had never associated with her before. How was it possible? How was it that she knew exactly what to do in a moment of crisis when no one else did? He had always underestimated her, always seen her as nothing more than an employee, a part of the background. But now, in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, he couldn't ignore the growing realization that he had been wrong. It wasn't just her quick thinking in a medical emergency that impressed him. It was the way she had carried herself with such confidence. The way she had controlled the situation when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. It was the way she had treated his mother, like a person, not just someone to be served. The Mafia boss looked down at his mother, her face softening with each passing minute. She wasn't out of the woods yet, but she was alive. And it was because of the nanny. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had always assumed that power and money were the keys to everything. He had always believed that the strong controlled the world, and that those who were weak existed to serve them. But now, watching the woman who had always been in the background, he began to see things differently. The woman who had lived a life of service, who had never once asked for anything in return, had just shown more strength and courage than anyone he had ever known. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the door opening. The nanny stood in the doorway, her eyes meeting his with a quiet, steady gaze. He couldn't bring himself to speak immediately, his words trapped somewhere between gratitude and the swirling confusion in his mind. "Is she going to be okay?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nanny stepped inside, moving toward the bed with the grace of someone who had seen much, but never lost her composure. "She'll be fine," she said softly, her hands gently adjusting the blankets over his mother. "She's strong. Just give her time." Her voice was so calm, so sure of herself, that for the first time, the Mafia boss believed her. It was a feeling he wasn't used to, believing in someone outside his inner circle, someone he had never truly considered. He watched as she checked his mother one last time, her professional demeanor never wavering. And then, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking, she looked up and met his eyes. "You should get some rest," she said. "You've been through a lot." For a moment, he was taken aback. He had never heard her speak so plainly, without fear or hesitation. He had never seen this side of her before, the side that wasn't just a servant but a woman with dignity, intelligence, and authority. And in that moment, as he stood there, still processing everything that had just happened, he realized something else. He didn't need to be the one in control all the time. He didn't have to be the one to fix everything. There were people in his life, people like her, who were more than capable of handling situations with a strength and grace he had never given them credit for. The Mafia boss took a step back, looking at the nanny for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they were true. She had saved his mother's life, and he owed her more than just gratitude. He owed her respect. The nanny gave him a small nod, her expression unchanged, as though this was simply another day in her life. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "I'm just doing my job." But the Mafia boss knew better now. It was more than a job. It was her calling. And for the first time, he was truly seeing her for who she was, not just a maid, but someone who could stand beside him as an equal. The following days were a whirlwind, with doctors coming and going, and the Mafia boss's mother slowly regaining consciousness. The tension in the mansion was palpable, but something had changed. The Mafia boss, once so sure of his own power and control, found himself questioning everything. The woman he had always dismissed as just the help had done the impossible. She had saved his mother's life. She had brought her back from the edge of death when no one else could. As the days passed, the Mafia boss began to observe her in a new light. Gone were the days when he saw her merely as an employee, someone who blended into the background of his luxurious life. Now, she was something more, a figure of strength, resilience, and quiet authority. One evening, as the sun began to set over the sprawling estate, the Mafia boss found himself in the garden, alone with his thoughts. He had never been one to reflect much on his life, his decisions, or the people in it. But now, he couldn't help but do so. He stood by the fountain, watching the water ripple as his thoughts consumed him. It was then that she appeared, silently approaching from behind. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her presence was unmistakable. "I didn't expect to find you out here," she said softly, her voice gentle but strong. He finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I find myself thinking a lot these days," he said quietly, "about things I've taken for granted." She didn't respond immediately, allowing him to continue. "I've spent my life believing that power and control were the most important things," he continued, his voice tinged with something unfamiliar, regret, perhaps, or a sense of vulnerability he had long buried. "But you showed me something different. You saved my mother's life. And I've never been more grateful for anything in my entire life." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The nanny didn't look surprised, but she did meet his gaze, her eyes soft and steady. "I only did what anyone would have done in my position," she said calmly, though her words held a weight of their own. "You don't have to thank me." The Mafia boss was taken aback. "Anyone?" he repeated, almost incredulously. "You think anyone would have done what you did? To step in when everyone else was paralyzed with fear? No, not anyone. Only someone who truly understands what it means to take care of people." The nanny remained silent, her gaze never leaving his. For the first time, the Mafia boss noticed something in her eyes, something more than just professionalism. It was compassion. It was a depth he hadn't realized she possessed, a depth he hadn't given her credit for. It made him wonder what else she had been hiding all these years, what else she had seen and experienced that had shaped her into the woman standing before him now. Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice softer than before. Why didn't you tell me what you've been through? What you've done? The nanny hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. It wasn't my place, she said finally. My job is to take care of the family, not to draw attention to myself. The Mafia boss frowned. But you've been a part of this family for so long, he said, his tone growing more serious. You've earned the right to be seen. The nanny didn't respond, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps a hint of a smile, but it was gone too quickly for him to be sure. Instead, she simply nodded, as if accepting his words but not allowing them to change anything. The moment hung between them for a while, and for the first time, the Mafia boss felt a strange sense of calm in her presence. He wasn't used to feeling this way, especially around someone who had always been beneath him, in his eyes. But now, standing there in the garden, he felt something shift. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was powerful. What happens now? He asked after a long silence. The nanny regarded him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. Now, she repeated. Now, you start seeing things differently. She turned to leave, but before she did, she glanced back at him. And you start respecting those around you, no matter their place in the world. With that, she walked away, leaving the Mafia boss standing there, his mind racing with thoughts he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But one thing was certain, he had never seen her this way before, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The days following his mother's recovery were a strange mix of relief and unease for the Mafia boss. His mother, once again stable and recovering in her room, had not only survived the scare, but was slowly regaining her strength. But it was the events leading up to that moment, the moments when the nanny had saved his mother's life, that still haunted him. It was as if everything had shifted overnight. The way he saw the world, the way he saw people, especially the people who had always worked for him, those who had been invisible to him. He had always thought that his position of power, his wealth, his family's legacy, was all that mattered. He had always assumed that those who served him were just that, servants, nothing more. But now, standing in the quiet halls of the mansion, he found himself thinking about the nanny. How had she known what to do when no one else did? How had she, a mere employee in his eyes, stepped forward and taken charge when the situation was at its most dire? He couldn't stop thinking about it. And he couldn't stop thinking about her. How calm she had been, how competent, how much strength she had shown when he had expected the opposite. He had seen her work tirelessly for years, caring for his family, cleaning, cooking, and managing the household. But he had never truly seen her. Not like this. He had always admired strength, but never realized it could come in such a quiet form. The next day, after spending hours walking the grounds of the estate trying to clear his mind, he decided to take action. He needed to speak with her. It was a strange thought. He had never thought he would need to speak with her beyond the occasional passing instruction or request. But now it was different. He needed answers, or at least, a conversation to understand why he felt this shift inside himself. The nanny was in the kitchen when he arrived, as she always was, her movements efficient as she prepared lunch for the family. She didn't look up when he entered, and for a moment, he hesitated. But then he stepped forward. "We need to talk," he said, his voice deeper than usual, more uncertain. The nanny paused, then slowly turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "About what?" she asked calmly, as if this was a normal conversation. "About everything," he replied. "About you. About what happened. About why you stepped in when no one else could." She was quiet for a long moment, and he could feel her eyes on him. She had seen something in him, too. He had seen it in the way she treated his family, in the way she never hesitated to act, never demanded anything in return. She wasn't like anyone he had ever known. "I didn't do anything special," she said quietly, as if the events of the past few days were nothing extraordinary. "I just did what needed to be done." Her words stung more than he had expected. He had thought she would explain it all, that she would give him some sense of closure. But instead, she simply dismissed it, as if her actions were as ordinary as any other task. "That's the problem," he said, his frustration starting to surface. You don't see it, do you? What you did wasn't ordinary. It was heroic. You saved my mother's life, and I need to understand why you did it. She studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, unwavering. Because I knew it was the right thing to do, she said simply. It's what I've always done. It's what I do for everyone I care for. But why not me? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, a hint of vulnerability creeping in. She blinked, her expression softening just slightly. You never asked, she said, her words heavy with a truth he had never wanted to face. You never saw me. Not like this. But I've always been here, doing my job, taking care of you, of your family. I never needed to be seen. I only needed to do what was right. His chest tightened as the weight of her words settled in. He had never truly seen her. He had taken her for granted, just as he had taken everything else in his life for granted. The power, the wealth, the respect. None of it mattered when it came to the simple acts of humanity that she had shown him. I've been wrong, he admitted quietly, looking down at his feet. I've overlooked everything that matters. The nanny remained silent, her eyes no longer cold, but simply understanding. I don't expect anything from you, she said softly. I never have. But you'll need to learn to see people for who they are, not just what they can do for you. He nodded, unsure of what else to say. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with acknowledgement, with a change that had been long overdue. For the first time, he felt as though he was beginning to see the world through her eyes, and it was more than he had ever imagined. The Mafia boss had always seen himself as the one who controlled everything. But now, he realized, there were forces more powerful than control, more lasting than power. And they were the things he had taken for granted for far too long. After their conversation in the garden, things were different. The Mafia boss found himself walking through his mansion with a new sense of awareness, a new understanding of the people around him. He had always been accustomed to being the one who controlled every situation, every decision, but now, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His perception of those in his life, especially the people who worked for him, had completely changed. He had seen his nanny in a different light, and it was clear that she was far more than just an employee. She had shown him something he had never realized before: true strength, kindness, and humility in the face of a crisis. As the days passed, the Mafia boss couldn't help but wonder about the woman who had saved his mother's life. Her quiet demeanor, her unwavering resolve, and her ability to act under pressure had left a deep impression on him. He found himself thinking about her often, reflecting on everything she had done for his family, and yet, he had never truly acknowledged her worth. He had never taken the time to see her for who she truly was. It wasn't until that moment when she had saved his mother that he had fully realized what she had brought to his life. One evening, he decided to approach her again. He wasn't entirely sure what he wanted to say, but he knew he had to speak to her. She was in the kitchen again, as usual, preparing dinner for the family. She was moving with the same efficiency, the same quiet grace that he had always admired. But this time, he noticed something else. There was a sense of peace in the way she moved, a calmness that seemed to radiate from her. It was as if she had a wisdom that the rest of the world hadn't yet caught up to. He approached her slowly, unsure of how to begin. I've been thinking, he started, his voice hesitant, about what you said to me, about seeing things differently. She paused, turning to face him. Her expression was neutral, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. And? She asked simply, waiting for him to continue. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I realized something. I've spent my whole life thinking that power, control, and wealth were everything. That those were the things that defined a person's worth. But you showed me that it's not just about that. He paused, trying to find the right words. You showed me that what really matters is the way we treat others. The way we care for the people in our lives. The nanny's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't say anything. He continued, his voice more earnest now. I've been wrong. I've never really seen you for who you are. And I regret that. There was a long silence between them, and for a moment, he thought she might dismiss his words, as she had done before. But instead, she spoke quietly. I don't need your apology, she said. I've never needed anyone to see me. I've always done my work because it's the right thing to do, not because I wanted recognition. The Mafia boss felt a pang of guilt at her words. He had never understood her motivation, never realized that for her, It wasn't about gaining favor or being seen as important. She had simply done her job with dedication and integrity, even when he hadn't acknowledged it. "But I see you now," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "And I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done for my family. For my mother. You've done more than anyone else could have done, and I can never thank you enough for that." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded, as if accepting his words without needing to say anything in return. "I'm just doing my job," she replied simply. The Mafia boss found himself smiling, a small but genuine smile. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was beginning to understand something that had eluded him for years. He had always believed that he was the one who controlled everything, that his wealth and status gave him power over the world. But now, he realized that there were people in his life, people like the nanny, who had a power far greater than anything money could buy. It was the power of kindness, humility, and strength in the face of adversity. "You've taught me something," he said, his voice softening. "And I won't forget it." She gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod, then turned back to her work, the rhythm of her movements unbroken. As he left the kitchen, the Mafia boss felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he felt like he was beginning to understand what truly mattered in life. It wasn't about control or power. It was about the people you cared for and the way you treated them. And in that moment, he realized that the people he had overlooked for so long, the ones who had always been there, quietly doing their part, were the ones who had the greatest impact on his life. He had a lot to learn, but for the first time, he was willing to listen. The days after the conversation in the kitchen felt like a slow transformation for both the Mafia boss and the nanny. The Mafia boss couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had fundamentally changed. For the first time in his life, he had truly reflected on the people around him. He realized that the respect he had once taken for granted, especially from the staff, was no longer something he could simply expect. He needed to earn it. And the woman who had been at the center of his newfound awareness was the nanny. The black woman who had always been a quiet presence in the mansion, always in the background, had changed everything. She had saved his mother's life, and in doing so, had opened his eyes to a world he had never truly seen. He found himself seeking her out more frequently, but each time he approached, she remained as composed and distant as ever, maintaining the professional distance she had always kept. He respected that, but a part of him longed for something more, something deeper. His mother, still recovering, often asked him about the nanny, wondering how it was that such a quiet woman had been the one to take charge during the crisis. "She's a woman of strength," he would tell her. "I've come to understand that, more than ever." But even as he spoke those words, a part of him knew he hadn't fully understood. Not yet. The next week, as the mansion returned to a semblance of normalcy, the Mafia boss found himself walking down one of the hallways late at night, unable to sleep. He had been thinking about the nanny again. Something about her calm nature, her ability to take control when everything else seemed out of his grasp, had him questioning his own life. He had always been the one in control, always the one who made the decisions, the one people looked up to. But now, after everything that had happened, he realized how much he had been missing. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He turned, expecting to see one of the staff members, but instead, it was her. The nanny, as always, was dressed simply, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she walked toward him with the same quiet grace. "You couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly soft. She shook her head slightly. "No, sir," she replied, her voice calm. "I find peace in the stillness of the night." He studied her for a moment, noticing the way she always carried herself. Never too much, never too little. "I've been thinking," he said after a pause, "about everything." She nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "And?" she asked. "You're right," he said. "About what you said in the kitchen. About seeing things differently. I've been wrong, and I've been blind to a lot of things." The nanny's gaze softened, but she didn't say anything. "I've treated people as if their worth was based on what they could do for me," he continued. "And I never truly saw them for who they were. Not until now. Not until you." For the first time, he saw something flicker in her eyes, a brief glimmer of something he couldn't quite identify. "It's not about me," she said quietly. "It's about the people you surround yourself with. If you truly want to lead, you have to lead with humility, not with authority alone. The words struck him deeply. She was right. He had always believed that authority was the key to leadership, but now he realized it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Leadership wasn't about control or fear. It was about respect, understanding, and the ability to see people for who they were, not just what they could offer. He sighed, feeling the weight of everything he had learned over the past few weeks. I think I understand now, he said, his voice almost lost in the quiet of the night. But I don't know how to show that. How? To make it right. The nanny looked at him for a long moment, then said, You're doing it right now. The fact that you're willing to see things differently, to admit your mistakes, that's the first step. He smiled faintly, a sense of peace washing over him. I never thought I'd be the one to say this, but thank you. For everything. For saving my mother. For teaching me something I never understood. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming on her lips. It's my job, she said simply. But the Mafia boss knew better now. He knew that her role was far more than just a job. She had saved his family, and in doing so, had saved him from his own ignorance. You're not just the help, he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. You're a part of this family, and I won't forget that. For the first time, the Mafia boss felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the nanny, but for the realization that sometimes the greatest leaders were not the ones who commanded the most power, but the ones who knew how to see and value the people around them. As he walked away, he knew that his life had changed, not because of what he had gained, but because of what he had finally learned. And as he looked back over his shoulder, he saw the nanny standing there, her calm presence now something he would never take for granted again. The weeks following their conversation in the kitchen had been a turning point in the Mafia boss's life. Every day, he woke up with a new sense of awareness, a new understanding of the world around him. His interactions with those in his household had changed. He could no longer look at the people who had served him without acknowledging their value, their strength, and their humanity. But it was the black nanny, the woman who had always been quietly present in his life, who had changed everything for him. Her actions during his mother's collapse had opened his eyes in a way he never imagined. He had seen his staff as just that, staff. People who worked for him, but were invisible, existing only to serve his needs. He had never once questioned this assumption. Until now, he found himself seeking her out more and more, wanting to understand who she truly was, wanting to know how she could possess such quiet strength, such wisdom, and such grace under pressure. She had shown him something he had never learned from his family, his associates, or even his closest friends: humility. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his mother's collapse had been the catalyst for a deeper shift in him. It wasn't just that she had saved his mother's life. It was the way she had done it, the way she had acted without fear, without hesitation, and without the need for recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. He had never seen that before. And the more he observed her, the more he began to admire her, to respect her, not just for what she had done, but for who she was. One evening, the Mafia boss found himself in the library, pacing back and forth. His thoughts were consumed by the nanny. He couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to say something to her, something that acknowledged the shift in their relationship. He had never been one to express gratitude, to admit when he had been wrong, but now, after everything that had happened, he felt it was time. He found her in the hallway, just outside the kitchen, as she was passing through on her way to another task. She didn't see him at first, but when she did, she paused. There was a quiet moment of recognition between them. I've been thinking about you, he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. I don't know why it took me so long to see you for who you really are. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. I've always treated you as just the help, he admitted, his tone serious. But you're not just the help. You're something more. She didn't respond right away, but he could see the slight shift in her expression. I'm not looking for anything more from you, she said quietly. I do my job because it's what I believe in. The Mafia boss nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. I know, he said, but I've been blind. I've been blind to the people around me, to the ones who have always been there, giving their best and asking for nothing in return. I've only ever seen them as tools, as people who serve me. But you've shown me that there's more to people than what they can do for you. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes softening just a bit. It's not about what they can do for you, she said. It's about what you can do for them. It's about recognizing the value in others, even when they don't ask for it. That's what makes a true leader. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always believed that leadership was about power, about commanding others and making decisions from a position of strength. But now, after everything he had seen and learned, he realized that true leadership wasn't about authority. It was about respect. Respect for those around you, regardless of their position in life. I've never been the kind of person to show respect, he said softly, almost to himself. But I want to be. I want to learn how to lead with respect, not just with power. She gave him a small nod, acknowledging his words without needing to say anything more. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air between them. Finally, the Mafia boss broke the silence. Thank you, he said, his voice low but sincere. For everything. For showing me what it means to truly see the people around me. The nanny looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once more. You don't need to thank me, she said, her voice steady. Just lead with integrity, and you'll find your way. With that, she turned and continued down the hallway, leaving him standing there, watching her. As he watched her walk away, the Mafia boss realized that he was a different person now. He had learned something he had never thought possible. That true leadership came from humility and respect, not from control and fear. And as he stood there, he understood that the most powerful people in his life were not the ones who commanded attention or fear, but the ones who led with kindness and strength. The nanny had shown him that, and he would never forget it. The Mafia boss could feel the change within him. It wasn't something he could explain in simple terms, but it was there, a quiet transformation that had begun the day his mother collapsed. He no longer saw his mansion, his wealth, or even his power in the same way. His life had been built on the assumption that his status made him invincible, but now, after everything that had happened, he understood how fragile everything truly was. The nanny had been the one to open his eyes. She had taken control when everyone else had panicked. She had stepped forward to save his mother's life without any expectation, without seeking recognition. And in doing so, she had changed him. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about a newfound respect. He began to see her differently, not just as the woman who had taken care of his family, but as someone who had strength, wisdom, and an undeniable presence. But this was a change he could not process alone. One evening, after spending hours reflecting, he decided to seek her out again. She had become more than just a part of his household. She had become a part of his understanding of what it meant to lead. The Mafia boss found her outside, standing by the garden fountain as the night air cooled the summer heat. Her back was turned, and for a moment, he hesitated. She was, after all, still someone who had always remained distant, professional, composed. But that had all changed. He took a step closer. You were right, he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence of the evening. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze without expression, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him feel vulnerable, something he had never experienced with anyone before. Right about what? She asked, her voice calm, almost indifferent, as if their previous conversations had been nothing out of the ordinary. About everything, he said, pausing as if the words themselves were heavy. About how I've been blind. About how I've never truly seen the people around me. She said nothing at first, just looked at him, as though waiting for him to say more. You saved my mother's life, he continued, his tone sincere. And it was more than just a medical intervention. It was something that made me realize how much I've missed, the people I've overlooked, the strength I never saw in those closest to me. She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. I only did what needed to be done, she replied softly. I don't need. Thanks. I don't need recognition. He felt a pang in his chest, but he knew he needed to say this. I'm not thanking you just for what you did for my mother, he said. I'm thanking you for what you did for me. For showing me what it means to be truly present for the people in your life. The silence stretched between them, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if she understood. She had always been a quiet presence, but now, he wanted her to know that he saw her. For the first time, really saw her. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd admit I was wrong, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. But I've been wrong. All this time. And I want to change. I want to do better, not just for my family, but for the people who serve us. She finally spoke, her voice still steady. Change comes when you're ready for it, she said. You can't force it. You have to understand, truly understand, why it matters. And you can't expect to get everything right immediately. But what matters is that you're willing to learn. He took in her words, feeling their weight settle deep within him. I never understood that before, he said quietly. I thought leadership was all about strength, about making decisions, and asserting power. But now I see it's about being humble. It's about respecting the people around you. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. That's the first step, she said, as though she had known all along. Respect goes both ways. You have to trust the people around you, just as they trust you. Leadership is about giving others the space to lead, too. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustle of the trees in the breeze. The Mafia boss found himself reflecting on what she had said. She was right. Leadership wasn't just about commanding from the top. It was about empowering others, about recognizing that every person had something valuable to contribute. You've taught me more than I could ever have learned from anyone else, he said, his voice a mixture of admiration and gratitude. She gave him a slight, acknowledging nod. It's my job, she said simply, the humility in her voice clear. But that's not all, he said, a new sense of determination growing within him. I want to make sure you know how much you mean to this family, how much you've changed everything. You're more than just the nanny. You're someone who deserves more than just a job. You deserve respect, recognition, and she stopped him with a small wave of her hand. I don't need any more than that, she said. But if you want to make a difference, then start by showing others the same respect you're showing me. He smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. It was the first time in a long time that he felt like he was on the right path, one where leadership was based on something deeper than power. It was a path of respect, humility, and a recognition of the value in everyone around him. I will, he said, knowing that he meant it. Thank you. As she walked away, the Mafia boss felt a quiet sense of peace. He had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength wasn't about domination or control, but about the ability to see others for who they truly were. And for the first time, he realized that it was the people who had always been there, quietly doing their best, who had shaped his world in ways he had never acknowledged before. In the weeks that followed their conversation, the Mafia boss found himself constantly reflecting on everything he had learned. The mansion, once a place that felt suffocating with its opulence and grandeur, now seemed quieter, more peaceful. The weight of his power, which had once defined him, no longer felt so heavy. He found himself increasingly aware of the people around him, the ones he had once taken for granted. His interactions with his staff had changed. He no longer saw them as faceless figures who carried out orders. He saw them as individuals, each with their own stories, their own strength. The nanny, in particular, had left an indelible mark on him. She had shown him a side of leadership he had never considered. It was no longer just about commanding respect. It was about earning it, showing humility, and recognizing the value in everyone. As the days went by, he found himself seeking her out more and more. He wanted to understand her better, wanted to know the woman who had changed his life without even trying. He had already thanked her, but he knew that wasn't enough. He needed to do more. It was one late evening when he found her in the garden, just like the night they had first spoken about everything. She was standing near the fountain, her gaze fixed on the stars above. The Mafia boss approached her, his steps quiet, his mind steady. He had something important to say, something that had been on his mind for days. I've been thinking, he started, his voice strong but calm. About what you've said. About leadership. About respect. She turned slightly, acknowledging his presence, but made no move to speak. He continued. I've spent my entire life believing that power was what made a man strong. But you've shown me that strength comes from within, from how we treat others. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. I can't undo everything I've done, but I want to start. I want to make sure you know that I see you now, for who you truly are. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. And I want you to know that you are part of this family. You're not just the help. You never were. The nanny stood still for a moment, her back straight as she considered his words. Then, without looking at him, she spoke softly. I'm just a woman doing her job, she said. I don't need to be seen, not in the way you're asking. His heart sank at her words, but he refused to let that discourage him. I know, he said, taking a step closer. But I need you to understand something. You've always been more than just a servant to this family. You've been a protector, a guide, and a voice of reason when we didn't even know we needed one. That's not something I take lightly." She met his gaze then, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "You've already started to change. That's all I could ever ask for." He looked at her, his mind running through everything they had spoken about, everything that had happened. She had saved his mother, but more than that, she had saved him from the person he had been, the man who saw everything in terms of control and power. He had seen the world through a lens of authority, but now, he saw it through a lens of connection. The power he had once believed in no longer seemed so important. The connections he made with the people around him, the way he treated them, the way he made them feel, these were the things that mattered. He didn't need to be the one in charge of everything anymore. He had learned that the strongest leaders were the ones who knew how to empower those around them. He had learned that strength came in many forms. And now, he wanted to lead differently. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice steady. "But I want you to know that whatever happens, you are a part of this family. I will treat you with the respect you deserve." The nanny didn't reply immediately, but after a long pause, she spoke. "That's all anyone can ask for," she said quietly. "To be respected, to be seen." A small smile appeared on her face, just for a moment. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, and it filled him with a warmth he hadn't expected. As he stood there, the sound of the water gently flowing in the fountain, he realized how much had changed. He had once been so focused on his own power that he had overlooked the most important things in life, the people around him. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to see them. He was beginning to see her. And he knew, deep down, that he would never be the same again. The change in the Mafia boss had not gone unnoticed. People in his household, once accustomed to his stern and unyielding leadership, began to see the subtle shift in him. The way he interacted with his family, with the staff, and even with himself, had evolved. It wasn't just the grand gestures or the newfound respect for his mother's caretaker, the nanny. It was in the small moments, the pauses in conversation, the more thoughtful decisions, the quieter moments of reflection that replaced his once domineering presence. He had started to truly see the people around him. And yet, despite all the progress, there was still something unsettled inside him. The nanny had made him realize the importance of recognizing people for who they were, rather than what they could do for him. But now, he wondered if that realization was enough. Was it enough to truly make amends for all the years he had spent blind to the lives of those around him? Was it enough to repair the damage he had done by seeing them only through the lens of power? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself standing at the large windows of his office, looking out over the estate. His thoughts were tangled, his emotions running deeper than they had in years. He thought of his mother, who was still recovering, and the part he had played in her suffering. He thought of the nanny, the woman who had saved her life, and how little he had appreciated her until it was almost too late. His mind lingered on the weight of responsibility. It wasn't just about fixing things with the people around him. It was about becoming someone different, someone worthy of the respect he was now trying to earn. He didn't know if he could fully make up for the years of disregard, but he was determined to try. That was when he decided to visit her again. It wasn't for a conversation or a declaration of thanks. It wasn't even about understanding her better. This time, he just wanted to be near her, to acknowledge her presence. The nanny was in the garden, as she often was in the evenings, tending to the plants, her movements graceful, almost meditative. He hesitated before approaching her, unsure of the right words. He had said so much before, but now, it felt as though the time for talking was over. The time for action had arrived. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said softly, approaching her from behind. She didn't turn to face him immediately, but he could feel her awareness of his presence. She simply nodded as if waiting for him to continue. "I don't want to just talk about change. I want to show it. Not just to you, but to everyone who has been here all this time. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be someone who leads by example. Someone who earns the respect of the people around him, not just because of what he has, but because of who he is." He watched her, waiting for a response. She didn't speak at first, her focus still on the plants, but there was something in the way she stood, something that told him she was considering his words carefully. "Actions speak louder than words," she said at last, turning to look at him. It's easy to say you want to change. It's harder to actually do it. But I believe you can. If you're truly willing to try. Her words struck him harder than he had expected. He had always been a man of words, of plans, of strategies. But now, as he stood there in front of her, he realized that it wasn't enough to merely speak of change. He had to live it. He had to embody it every day. I will, he said quietly, his voice firm with resolve. And I'll show you, and everyone else, that I mean it. She nodded, her expression unreadable but not unkind. I know you will, she said softly, her gaze softening just a fraction. But remember, it's not about proving something to me. It's about proving it to yourself. The Mafia boss felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he heard those words. They weren't just a simple encouragement. They were a reminder that the path to change was one he had to walk for himself, not for anyone else. He had spent too long trying to prove his worth to the world, to the people around him. But now, for the first time, he understood that the real work was internal. It was about proving to himself that he could be the man he wanted to be, the man who deserved respect, not because of his power, but because of his actions. The nanny turned back to the plants, but this time, there was a small smile on her face, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. You've already made a good start, she said quietly, before resuming her task. The Mafia boss stood there for a moment, taking in the stillness of the garden, the quiet of the night, and the sense of peace that was slowly growing inside him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from victory or triumph. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing you were on the right path, even if that path was just beginning. As he walked away from the garden, he knew that he had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time, he was ready to walk it, ready to be someone different, ready to prove that change was possible, not just for him, but for everyone he cared about. The Mafia boss's transformation had been subtle, but it was undeniable. Each day brought new challenges, and each day he found himself confronted with situations where his past ways of thinking no longer worked. He had spent years building a life based on fear, power, and control, and now he was finding it difficult to navigate a world where kindness, humility, and respect had become the guiding principles. It was a struggle, but one he was determined to face. The more he reflected on his journey, the more he understood that true strength did not come from dominance. It came from the ability to empower others, to respect them, and to trust them. The nanny had shown him that. She had given him the example of how true leadership was not about commanding others from above. It was about working alongside them, recognizing their worth, and treating them as equals. The Mafia boss had never imagined he would find such lessons in a simple conversation with a member of his staff. But the nanny had proven him wrong. She had shown him that there was more to a person than what met the eye. The next morning, he decided to take action. He called a meeting, not with his associates, but with the household staff. He wanted to speak to them, to acknowledge the changes he had undergone, and to share his new vision for how the family would move forward. The staff gathered in the dining room, their faces filled with uncertainty. They had seen the changes in him, but they hadn't yet been told what it all meant. The Mafia boss stood at the head of the table, his gaze steady. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the man he had always wanted to be. He cleared his throat, and then began. I've made a lot of mistakes in the past, he said, his voice calm but firm. I've treated people like tools, like things that were meant to serve my will. But that ends now. He paused, letting his words sink in. I know I've overlooked the people who've been here for me, for this family, for so long. I've never truly seen you for who you are. But that changes today. The room was silent, and for a moment, he feared that his words might fall flat. But then he saw it, the small shift in their expressions. The staff was listening, really listening, for the first time. I want you to know that I see you, he continued, his voice softer now. I see all of you, and I respect you, not because of what you do for me, but because of who you are. There was a long silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The weight of his words lingered in the air, and for the first time, the Mafia boss felt the connection between him and the people around him. It wasn't based on power, it wasn't based on fear, it was based on something deeper, something more meaningful. The nanny, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. She met his gaze, and for the first time, there was a softness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice steady but filled with meaning. You've come a long way. Her words struck him deeply. He had never imagined he would hear such words from her, someone who had always remained so reserved, so professional. It made him realize just how far he had come, how much he had changed. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I couldn't have done it without you." The nanny didn't reply, but there was a small, knowing smile on her face as she turned back to the others. For the first time, the Mafia boss felt like he was truly part of something. He had always believed that he was above the people around him, that he had earned his place at the top. But now, he understood that his place wasn't at the top. It was with the people who had supported him, the people who had always been there, quietly doing their jobs, their work just as important as his own. The staff began to disperse, but the Mafia boss stayed behind for a moment, lost in thought. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had spent so much of his life focused on his own power, on controlling everything around him. But now he understood that true strength wasn't about control. It was about connection, about the people you trusted, and about the respect you showed them. The nanny had shown him that, and he knew that he would never go back to the way he was before. As he walked away from the meeting, he realized that his life had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. But it was a change he welcomed. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming the man he had always wanted to be, the man who could lead with strength and humility, who could see the worth in everyone around him. And for the first time, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. The days that followed the staff meeting were some of the most challenging yet rewarding for the Mafia boss. He had started the journey of change, but like all transformations, it wasn't without its bumps. He found himself facing obstacles, old habits that tried to resurface, moments of doubt where he questioned his ability to truly lead differently. But with every misstep, he learned. He learned the value of patience, not just with others, but with himself. His relationship with the nanny had evolved as well. She had always been a steady presence in his life, but now, she had become someone he turned to for guidance. She had saved his mother, but more than that, she had saved him from a life of blindness. Every conversation with her left him feeling more grounded, more aware of the world around him. She never asked for anything in return, but her actions spoke volumes. One afternoon, as he was walking through the mansion, he overheard a conversation between his mother and the nanny. His mother, who was still recovering, was speaking in soft tones, and the Mafia boss felt an urge to listen. He had become accustomed to the way his mother spoke to her, kindly, with a level of respect he had never fully understood before. "She's changed him," he heard his mother say. "I can see it in his eyes. He's becoming the man he was always meant to be." The Mafia boss stood still, hidden from view, struck by the truth of her words. For so long, he had been a man defined by power and control, and now, he was finally becoming someone who understood the true meaning of strength, someone who could inspire those around him, not through fear, but through respect and compassion. His mother's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in his life, he felt a deep sense of pride in himself. He had spent years believing that power was the ultimate goal, but now, he saw that true power was something else entirely. It wasn't in the ability to command others. It was in the ability to change, to grow, to lead with kindness, and to recognize the value of every individual in his life. The Mafia boss knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when he would be tempted to fall back into his old ways. But he also knew that he was no longer the same man he had been. He had learned, and he would continue to learn. And more than that, he had the people around him who would help him stay on the right path. His mother, the nanny, and the others who had always been there for him, even when he had failed to see their worth. Later that evening, he sought out the nanny once more. This time, he found her in the garden, her hands gently tending to the flowers. He approached her quietly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment, but also knowing that he had something important to say. "I heard what my mother said," he began, his voice steady. "And she's right." She didn't stop what she was doing, but he could see her pause slightly, sensing the gravity of his words. "I've changed," he continued, "and I'm going to keep changing. I know I have a long way to go, but I want you to know that I'm committed to it. I want to be the man who leads by respect, by understanding, not by fear." The nanny looked at him then, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. "You've already started," she said softly, "but you must keep going. It's not about making a grand gesture. It's about the small, everyday actions. It's about showing respect in everything you do. He nodded, her words ringing true in his heart. He had always thought leadership was about grand actions, bold decisions. But now he understood that true leadership was about the day-to-day, about showing up for the people around you, recognizing their worth, and acting with integrity. The Mafia boss stood there in silence, the weight of his realization settling over him. He knew that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. But for the first time, he felt confident that he was on the right path. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." The nanny gave him a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to thank me," she said, "but I'm glad you're on the right path." As he walked away, the Mafia boss realized that he had learned something far greater than any lesson he had ever received in the past. He had learned the true meaning of strength, of leadership, and of respect. He had learned that the people who truly shaped his life weren't the ones who had power or influence, but the ones who had quietly supported him, without expectation, without desire for recognition. And as he moved forward, he knew that he would never take them for granted again. His journey had just begun, but he was ready for it. He was ready to lead, not with power, but with respect, humility, and the understanding that everyone had something valuable to offer.